Hello, everyone. This is Eric Mastrota with the National Digest, and today I have the pleasure of speaking with Dr. Allan Gold, a retired school psychologist of nearly 50 years who has been engulfed in the advancement of mental health services and assistance within schools in America. Dr. Gold's career reflects a profound understanding of the psychological complexities that influence educational environments. His story offers a unique perspective on the evolution of school psychology and its crucial role in fostering student resilience and understanding. Hi, Dr. Gold. How are you doing today?
Fine, thank you. Pleasure to be here.
Yeah, thank you for being here. And, to get us started, for someone who has had the amount of experience within these school psychology systems, you've been able to see how therapies, counseling, and mental health services have expanded over the past few decades. So, from your perspective, what are some of the most significant changes you've observed as the conversation around mental health has become more mainstream? And what aspects do you think have remained more consistent?
Okay, very good question. Thinking even way back to when I was a student, back in the 50s, um, school psychology was just starting as a profession, and they sometimes had school psychologists at a district. I grew up in San Francisco. I remember being tested, an IQ test when I was in the seventh grade, but we had no counselors or no school psychologists at schools. So over the years, there's been, certainly a growth in the number of school psychologists and counselors, those assigned to schools. But I would say some of the most significant changes that I've observed are really that getting mental health for both children and adults has become far less stigmatized. When I was growing up, people didn't want to admit that they would be going to a psychologist or psychiatrist. They didn't want to talk about their mental health. It just wasn't dealt with at school. Now, of course, not all cultures and individuals are still not comfortable, or not all cultures are comfortable now talking about therapy for themselves or their children, but people are much more open now to getting assistance when they need it. Um, there's still a great need for therapy or counseling at all times of life. And I think adults are now more willing to send their children for help rather than um, get help themselves. So I think that's true. Um, for example, I believe that all couples who are considering living together as partners, and particularly if they're planning to have children, they should have premarital counseling. They may be just fine as a pair, but they need to explore how they were raised when considering raising kids together, because there may be serious differences that emerge and it can even split up parents. One parent may want to raise their child just the way they were raised. That same person may want to raise their child exactly the opposite because they don't like how they were raised, and they may um, be in agreement or they may not be. And, they may get along fine as a couple, but then when they um, start to raise children, that can trigger a lot of disagreements. So I think premarital counseling could present situations that often arise with children, like how do you toilet train them? Or if your child's not being respectful to you, how do you deal with that? Or if they're not doing their chores or their homework, or if they're stuck on video games and that kind of thing, how do you approach that? Because it's so important that parents raise children, um, particularly for important issues, that they're in agreement of how they do that. So therapy is an important, very, very important. And I've recently observed how even older people are having trouble with their adult children, and that comes down to how they were raised. Parenting is a very complicated task. It's one of the most difficult tasks, and even more so now than it was when I was a child. Um, the balance between promoting independence, because you want your kids to be able to be independent and good problem solvers, and also setting boundaries so that children can become mentally healthy adults. And another change is really how varied families are these days. With generally now there are two working parents or single working parents. There's often less management by parents. Um, Other parents are very fearful of negative things happening to their children and become overly protective. I'm sure you've heard of that term helicopter parents, where parents are constantly monitoring everything that their child is doing and giving them advice all the time, and they don't have the opportunity to, figure out problems themselves. 50 years ago, parenting was probably much more consistent with very, similar parents are boss attitudes and management. And that's why it's challenging now for therapists to understand parenting values and strategies in a very varied culture. It's very challenging. And as far as mental health, what's remained consistent, I think, there's always been the similar mental health issues, anxiety, depression, those kind of things, children having to deal with divorces and so on. So I don't, there have been some real changes, particularly which we may talk about later around social media and that kind of thing. But in families, there are definitely similar uh, problems that there have always been, you know. But as I've said, families have changed a lot, in the past 50 years, so that kids may have new um, issues that they have to deal with that they didn't have to deal with before.
Right. Yeah, and speaking on more of those consistencies and things that have kind of always existed, for many things like personal tragedy, family separation, addiction, and just in general, coming into your own identity has always been a part of the growing up experience. So, how do we approach these issues in a way that promotes healthy communication from the students, but then also when they go back home?
Okay, that's very, very important question. The older I have gotten, the more I realize how important communication is, not just between parents and kids, but among adults. Communication is super important. I mean, even if you think about how one word can make a difference and how somebody responds, because how one person interprets a word may be different than how another person interprets the word. So developing good communication is absolutely critical for parents to do and work hard on. As children get older, they really value privacy and they don't want to risk criticism and punishment if they do something they think their parents will consider wrong. Um, so parents need to start very early to assure kids both by their verbal responses and their nonverbal responses, their facial expressions, that mistakes are acceptable and kids can learn from mistakes. If you really think about it, so much of what kids are exposed to from the time they're born almost, or at least 1 year old, is you did that wrong. That's not right. And they're always corrected. And certainly when they go to school, if they make mistakes, teachers have to tell them. So how they communicate that is super, super important. And, parents need to engage their kids in conversations about feelings and make sure that their children feel safe in discussing their feelings. And that can be very tricky um, because it's easy for children to really hide their feelings. There's also you know, gender stereotypes, particularly for men. The old stereotype of a man, oh, you don't cry, that's being a girly or, and so hopefully that's changing a little bit. Men can express their emotions, but it's really important for parents to be good listeners. And not to say, oh, don't cry about that. Everything will be fine. To really understand and to listen. to what their kids are expressing. Um, and parents can share their own feelings in a kind of respectful way, especially if they're being disrespectful or angry, if the kids are being disrespectful or angry. So communication is very important. I used to teach kids um, about hard and soft feelings and about using I statements. So a hard feeling is basically anger, frustration, And how do people respond to anger is either they stick their fingers in their ears or they fight back, they yell back. And it's not a very effective way of resolving a difference of opinion. So I consider a soft feeling would be one that's like confusion or hurt or sadness or depression or worry, those kind of things. And if a child, and this applies really to people, regardless of age, but if a child can express or a parent can express a softer feeling, there's a greater chance that the other person will listen. So if the parent is, for example, say the kid's dawdling around and going to be late for school, um, and the parent says, "Hurry up, you're going to be late." Okay, so the kid probably is going to either continue dawdling around or shut up, mom, that kind of thing. However, if the parent could say an I statement, honey, I'm really worried that you're going to be late and get in trouble with the teacher. Or, I won't need to take you soon because I'm worried that I'm going to be late for my job and my boss is going to get mad at me. I think there's a better chance that the other person will listen and understand. Is it perfect? Is it always going to work? Probably not necessarily. But I think it enables people, regardless of their relationship, friend to friend, child to parent, parent to child, that they'll open up more. So I used to teach kids how to use I statements and softer feelings to express themselves. Um, so obviously, if there is a personal tragedy or a death or divorce in a family, school psychologists should be informed so they can support the kids at school. Um, you know, um, I used to do groups for children whose parents were divorced or were getting divorced, and it would help, I think, a lot, for them to be with other kids who are going through the same experiences and to be able to express their feelings. And and those were good. Um, and if there's a death in the family, it could even be a pet. It's great for kids to be able to express that. I mean, I dealt with, families where that happened, and you can't always predict how kids are going to be, even by gender. I remember a few years ago, a family that lost a mother, and the young son, who was in second or third grade, really wanted to talk to me about it. And the daughter, who was in fifth grade, didn't want to talk about it. And I saw the absolute reverse with another family that lost a father suddenly, a heart attack. And the daughter really wanted to talk about it, and the son didn't. So, but it's important that school psychologists are there to be able to you know be there for kids. So if they want to talk or if they can be persuaded to talk about their feelings, that's important. Now, adolescents are even more complicated, as you know. Um, Adolescents are struggling to figure out their own identities and will experiment with different peers as friends and different activities. And there's nothing wrong with parents letting their kids know how they manage that process and that it's a slow developing process. They need to be able to talk about drugs and alcohol and sexual activity, not necessarily revealing everything about themselves, but recognizing that curiosity is a part of growing up. Um, but they also have to establish their values. For example, a number of years ago, I had a parent of a seventh grade boy come to me and say, "I just discovered my son looking at pornography on the computer." And so I said, "That's difficult, but consider it a teachable moment." That's one expression we used is when a situation happens, what can you teach and learn from that? So I also used to give grade level parent meetings so parents could come and listen to what are the developmental areas in in cognitive, physical, cognitive, social, emotional, and moral development. And they would be parents invited for kids all at the same grade level. And there's always a range of development at that grade level. But it was good to have advice and for parents to be together. One of the primary um, messages I wanted to convey is that parenting really it's a group project. We do it from school and from home, but also parents need to have good communication with other parents because as kids get older, they may hide things from their parents and they may tell their friends, and their friends may tell their parents. And so, what do you do if you find out about your child's friend who's doing something that may be very concerning? Your kid may say, my friend so and so is smoking dope or beginning to have sex or something like that. And sorry, I'm being graphic about this stuff, but this is what happens. And so do the parents. So I always encouraged from the time parents were in had kindergarten kids to be able to talk to other parents and share information. Um, it's often very difficult. And, I would teach parents to say, I'm not sure this is true. I've just heard this, but I felt like you wanted to know. And no parent ever said that they wouldn't want to know information, but how it's communicated is very important. So, like when I was talking about the pornography, I was saying, and I would tell parents, if you're really worried about your kids doing something like that, and by the way, um, in subsequent years, I heard it from fifth graders, parents. I heard it from third graders. So, now there's little protections, um, with what kids are exposed to, which is a lot different than it was when I was growing up, for sure. So I would tell parents, it's so important for you to have your own values, whether it's pornography or I don't want you to play and watch violent video games. What It's important, and that's why it's so important for parents to have that common value system that they can both communicate to a parent. Now, I mean, to the child, whether the child's going to listen to them is another whole issue. But I think it's important to say, I'm really worried about your getting addicted to um, video games because that doesn't help you socialize with other kids. Or I'm very worried if you see pornography because you're very young. And what the message that conveys is that everybody has to look a particular way, be beautiful, or have large breasts, or whatever. Um, and relationships are so much deeper and people make money off of that too. And relationships are so much more critical and complicated than just sexual activity. I understand your curiosity and you're welcome to ask anything, but that's not a good way to be exposed to relationships or violence. That this is a violent world. I'm very afraid that when you see violent games, you'll be numbed and that's not good. So maybe you don't agree with me, but I we are going to make sure that you don't watch violent video games while you're young, or you don't watch pornography. So explaining those values, I think, is really, really important. So they do need to be like we used to have classes on the effects of drugs and alcohol on the brain, because and parents need to be aware of that so they can explain. Um, hopefully schools do educate kids on that, but if not, it's parents' responsibility, um, because their brains are not fully developed. They won't be fully developed until they're 28 for women, age 28, and 30 for men. So even yours might still be developing a little bit. But so what it does is really limit the growth of the brain and talk about, sexual activity and the risk of unprotected sex. And they parents need to teach kids how to say no to other people, and some are good at that, and others are not very good at that. And so I know this is a lot of information, but it just really says how complex children's experiences are these days, and how important the parental involvement in it really is. And so if they build that um, that ability in young kids to share information with their parents so that they don't feel criticized or wrong, that they're hiding stuff. That's important because, as I said, when kids become adolescents, they do want to have private lives and they don't share everything. But parents need earlier to say, if you're ever in a situation in the next few years, like at a party where people are drinking and you don't want to do it, you're welcome to call me on the cell phone and we'll pick you up and we can have a code word or something like that. Um, but, children are curious and they are going to experiment with things. Um, but, parents just getting mad does not, um, solve the problem. It's like with those I statements I was saying, I'm really worried about you. I love you very much and I care about you. And even though I tried some of these activities, maybe I was older or in college or something like that, I just worry about you. And I'm curious why you feel the need to do that. Is it just curiosity, or do you want not to be rejected by friends and stuff like that? So having those conversations is really important. You
Yeah, no, definitely. I love that we're putting so much focus on the importance of creating and establishing these healthy communication techniques because it speaks to this greater idea that we've discussed before about having a safe space for these kids, both like inside the home and outside. So, how do you think we can emphasize the importance of creating safe spaces outside of the home too, to parents, school workers, and to the kids themselves? And why are these safe spaces so integral for overall emotional development?
Yes. Well, it's so important, is to feel safe, because particularly at school, you want to kids we don't want kids to be worrying while they're listening to teachers, whether it's worrying about their academics or worrying about their physical safety. That's absolutely important. And at home, you want kids are young. You want them to enjoy their youth and to be able to play and relax and be with other kids and be with their parents and do fun things. And if the world is not a safe place, that super limits. And we know that there are cultures in this country and certainly in the world where it isn't safe. I mean, I know I'm not supposed to be political, but I'm very, very much against guns. And ever since the Columbine shooting in 1999 and the Sandy Hook shooting in 2012, you know, I understand how kids can be very afraid of going to school because what if somebody brings a gun to school and 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 shoots people? You know, it's terrifying. You know, that has a totally um, post-traumatic stress syndrome impact for life, you know, if that happens. So it doesn't make any sense that the places shouldn't be safe, but eliminating that sort of extreme, um, you know, of a gun incident that we is happening now far too much, um, for everything from elementary schools to colleges. Um, but there are other areas of safety that are super important. Um, you know, I think what happens at home that doesn't feel safe is if the parents are abusive, either to each other or to their kids, and it could be physically abusive or um, emotionally abusive. I used to teach kids, fourth graders and fifth graders, about what I called the touch program, which was all about child abuse, and so that they would be aware of it. We talked about um, verbal abuse, saying bad things, mean things to your kids or to anybody saying that. Physical abuse, you know, beating, hurting, sexual abuse, which I didn't go into great detail about that, but you know, that's part of physical abuse, and neglect, which is also abuse, so that kids would be aware, not only for themselves, but if a friend told them about that, because they're not feeling safe. And the message was, if you hear about that, you tell a trusted adult at school, or if it's from outside of the home, you tell your parents. Um, so I wanted to give kids the I don't want to say weapons, but the tools to address these kinds of things. Now, at school, um, I won't say often, but a large percentage of kids don't feel safe at school because they're being bullied
Mm.
and teased. And that's that's very wrong. And I've seen it increase over the last years. Um, I can blame politicians, actors, athletes who use language that's very derogatory. And, you know, we think that kids are not aware of what goes on, but kids are far more aware of um, language and actions that adults do than we think they are. So whether they hear something directly, but they can be exposed to it. And giving permission to put down somebody else just increases the amount of bullying and teasing that goes on. Like I said, I mean, it's all, I was bullied too, or teased. I was a very short little kid, and people used to make fun of me, you know, called me shrimp and all that kind of stuff. I'm a little taller now, so, um, but you know, I wish I had had some tools to um, you know, sort of fight back with that. Not this kind of fight, but at least verbally say that it hurt my feelings and please don't do that. Um, so in the last few years, I used to go into classrooms and talk about bullying and teasing and what kids should not tease other kids about. Even kids as young as third graders knew what not to tease kids about. What about their looks, you know, their height, their weight, the color of their skin, whether they were wearing glasses or not, if they had any skin marks or anything like that. But they also knew that one shouldn't tease anybody about their religion, their language. If they're an immigrant family and they don't speak English very well, you don't make fun of that. And the things that you couldn't see, like if they had any learning disabilities or attention problems, sometimes you can see that, sometimes not. Um, their uh, gender identification, for older kids or well, not much older kids, because I've worked with kids as young as third grade who feel that they're transgender, um, and their sexual identity. Um, so the kids were pretty well aware of what not to, or what they're wearing, that kind of thing. Um, but, kids are often inclined to tease somebody if they're being teased. Like if their older brother or sister's teasing them at home, they don't feel they can give it back to the sibling, but when they get to school, they can you know dish it out on their peers because they're more the same size and they can do that. And that makes school very, very unsafe for kids. Another thing that makes school unsafe for kids is the challenge of academics. I worked in a very high socioeconomic district where the academic standards were very high. So if somebody were just sort of an average kid or a little below, they would struggle with the academics. And of course, we gave help as much as we could, including special education. That's a national requirement. But um, if kids feel they're incompetent, or they can't learn, or they can't learn as fast as other kids, um, that's other things that kids would tease about, like a learning disability, or they're just not as good sports, athletes, or as good actors, or dancers, or singers, or, I mean, the kids, as I said, knew not to tease other kids about that. But the teachers can really help with that, by encouraging, by finding something to compliment the kids on their effort, tell them what's right and not just what's wrong. Um, let them know that it's very natural for everybody, no matter how old you are, to make mistakes. Um, and so teachers correcting kids, that's a very delicate process. Um, and certainly if a kid is being teased, so I don't want to go to school, everybody's making fun of me. The parents need to let the school know. And I really believe fully that it's up to schools to work on, um, you know, preventing and stopping and dealing with teasing. Now, one thing that, and we'll probably talk about it, is um, what happens online,
Yeah,
with social networking and the horrible um, postings that happen there. So to to have a safe space is really um, so important. And the same thing is true for extracurricular activities. If somebody's on a baseball team or a soccer team, the coach needs to be kind to the kids. And, if they're not hitting home runs or making, baskets all the time or kicking soccer goals, the coaches need to. And I've heard, where from kids would tell me, oh, this coach is really, really nice. He's very caring, or this coach is mean,
mm,
that kind of thing.
yeah,
And so it's super important that uh, extracurricular activities make the kid feel like they're learning, and that it's okay if they make a mistake. I mean, it could be piano lessons too,
yeah,
There are very gifted musicians, but um, you know, you want that to be a safe place to learn.
yeah, yeah. Definitely. No, I love what you said about the awareness that kids have and how that could be underestimated. And kids are a lot more aware than we think. And it touches on another thing you said when we talk about the world that we live in now with technology and social media and being online and the internet. So, for you, as someone who has been in your field through the creation and development of the digital age that we're now living in, what are some of those big challenges and issues you've seen these kids go through as we've entered this world?
Yes, that I people always ask me, how is your job different now than it was in the, 70s and 80s? And I would say that technology is probably the biggest factor in the change, particularly since about 2000 or so. Um, I think it, it has so many effects. I mean, I'm not saying that technology is all bad. It's nice to have a cell phone to call somebody when you need to, and it's nice to have Google to look up information when you want to, and send emails and all that. But what's happened, probably since 2000 is well, one thing is the amount of time kids are spending on that. I mean, you see little 2 or 3 year olds on an iPad and just watching, perfectly innocent videos or playing little games, but it's very addictive,
Yeah.
you know. I remember maybe in 2012 or something like that. Uh, I went on it was a field trip to Ashland, Oregon from California for seventh and eighth graders to go see 5 plays in 3 days or something like that.
Mm,
Ashland has
right.
wonderful theater. And we were sitting in the reception area of the place we were staying, and there were all these kids. They weren't talking to each other. They were all on their phones.
Mm,
And, kids can be hanging out in a smaller, large group and they're all on their cell phones. They're really not talking. Thank God for school, where at least they have to talk some of the time.
yeah.
So I see that the technology has strongly negatively impacted normal communication.
Yeah.
They'll text each other, post comments. They can't see the nonverbal reactions like, why did you say that? Um, and or to have complex dialogues. You type something and or to ask questions to try to understand their comments. So I would say communication's been very limited and toxic, and it's very easy to post something negative about somebody when you don't see them and and you wouldn't say it. When I was growing up, if you had something nasty to say about somebody, you just say it, or most you do would pass a paper, a piece of paper along. Um, I spent a good deal of time trying to deconstruct negative communication among sometimes even as young as fifth graders, but certainly middle school kids, where I would get them together in a room and we would spend time trying to figure out what um, the one person meant by a comment.
Mm,
You're so mean, I hate you, well, describe mean. What did this person do? And like I said earlier, when you say a word, you don't know exactly what that means. So I would usually ask kids, what does mean mean? Well, she's always ignoring me when we're out in the playground. Okay, well, I understand that. Um, so sometimes I remember one time I had about almost a dozen sixth graders in June,
mm,
and school was almost over, and we sat in a room for an hour and 45 minutes trying to figure out why these two groups of kids were so mad at each other, and it had been going on for months,
yeah.
So it's not easy to, as I said, deconstruct the relationships between people and what goes wrong with people.
Mm,
Um, so that's one thing. I find communication is has been greatly affected by technology. And then addiction is the other main, I would say, difficulty with technology because there are so many kids that really are addicted to it. They feel like, and they're more isolated. I mean, there's plenty of research now that shows how isolated um, young people really are. They don't go out and play anymore. I remember once in a third grade social skills group, this was at least 10 years ago, if not longer, maybe 15. And I said, "What do you like to do outside?" And, some kids, "Oh, I like to go biking with my friend. I like to play baseball." And then was one kid who said, "Oh, I like to go out on the patio and play games on my computer."
Mm.
Ugh, you know. Uh, so, kids do get easily addicted to the technology. And whether it's video games, which are usually boys, or social media websites, which is usually girls, but it can be both. Um, and they just spend hours and hours on those. So I've considered, and I used to talk about this in my grade level parent meetings all the time, the huge challenge for parents is to manage the time that their kids spend on electronic devices. And it's so hard now because most schools, issue iPads or laptops to kids to do their work. So now AI is making it even more complicated. I'm certainly not an expert on that, but that's more challenging for professors and teachers because they don't know if their students are, just accessing AI to write essays and all that stuff. I've heard more recently, it's going back to blue books in college, which were what we had
Mm.
when you
Yeah.
had to write an essay,
Yeah.
for a test or in high school. But as I was saying, the huge challenge is for parents to manage the time that their kids spend on electronic devices. And because they're really good babysitters too. Even when a kid is like 2 years old, and you're busy doing your own work, put the kid on an iPad and that'll keep them amused. So I don't believe in that. Parents, if they have children, it's their responsibility to, particularly when they're little, to manage them and, not to um, just create an addictive activity for them. And so that can happen before kids even start school. And I think the longer the parents can keep kids off these devices, the better.
Mhm.
There was a organization called Wait Until 8.
Mm.
I don't know if it still exists, but it was basically saying don't give your kid a smartphone until they're in the eighth grade.
Right.
Now, whether that impacted I'd always wondered, and I thought that there should be some research on how are kids impacted who don't have regular access to social media and to smartphones.
Yeah.
I don't know. Are they rejected? Are they out of it? Um, but I also learned that, if kids would talk about things that I had no idea, I would just listen and ask a question. And so it sounded like I was more knowledgeable about whatever the kids were focusing on than I really was. But I don't know if kids would be rejected, but I don't think so.
Mm.
But who knows? But just for them to be able to find other things to do besides getting stuck. Now, the whole thing about addiction is really important. I used to suggest to parents that they um, do set limits both on school days and weekends about how much time kids could spend on the computer. So if it's or their phone, um, well, you've got a half an hour on a school day and you have to do your homework first. And then, but we can do some other things, watch TV. I mean, I have no problem with TV particularly, um, because families can do that together, actually. Um, but then I would tell parents, if you have a limit, a time limit on your child's using the computer or the phone, and you tell them, hey, 5 minutes to go. Okay, finish up. And the kid says, okay, I just need a couple more minutes and then I'll be through. And the kid gets off of it. Um, that shows that he or she has more control, more self-control. And I'd be less worried about it. But if the 5 minutes turns into 10, 15, 20, a half an hour, and a big argument, then I would say worry about addiction. The kid can't get off of it.
Mhm.
Uh, and, a couple of other things. Parents need to set a good example and a good role model by not being on their own phones and computers while their kids are at home. Now, that can be very difficult. Everybody wants to check their email. Everybody wants to, not everybody, but many people might have work that they have to do in the evening. But at least at dinner, I certainly suggest parents eat dinner with their kids. Now, funny thing, I didn't grow up that way for some reason. When my parents had dinner, my father was a teacher, and during the weekday, they would put me in the living room in front of the television, and I would watch Howdy Doody and the Mickey Mouse Club, and
Mhm.
so. And I'm not sure they did the right thing. I would eat dinner with them, I think, on weekends, but I think it's important that particularly now with such busyness in the world, that parents and kids eat together so they can share the ups and downs of the days and or the highs and lows and hear how, including parents talking about, well, I had a really good day today. This is what happened, or I had a difficult day today. This is what happened. Um, so they need to be able to listen to each other and share their daily experiences. So that's one thing. Um, this is a very, very challenging adjustment to make. Um, but parents need to try. The other thing they need to do is not allow their kids to have the phone in the bedroom when they go to sleep, or even look at a phone or computer for an hour, because there's research that shows that that really affects the blue light or whatever it
Yeah,
is, affects people's sleep. So you want kids to get, their 9 or 10 hours of sleep.
right.
And, it's very tempting to text somebody or to listen to a YouTube, um, show or something like that. So it, and it's very difficult for parents to be that strong,
Yeah.
there's a movement over the past 20 or 30 years that parents should be friends to their kids and not bosses.
Mhm.
Um, another, um, topic I used to talk about was, it's not exactly relevant to this, but it can be, is that parents have really two roles. One is manager and the other is consultant.
Mhm.
Now, a manager, tells you what to do, and knows everything. And when kids are little, parents are the managers, or they should be. They shouldn't just let their kids do any old thing.
Yeah.
Um, but as they get older, parents can actually, I'm not saying they should never manage their kids, they should, but they can also act as a consultant, particularly for activity, for social relationships that they're not involved in. So if a kid comes home, 8 or 9 or 10 or 11, says, I'm having a real difficult time with my friend, the parent can say, instead of saying, oh, well, just stop seeing him or her,
Right.
uh, the parent can act as a consultant. So, what does a consultant do? A consultant asks good questions, is a good listener, um, tries to brainstorm with the consultee um, possible solutions to the problem, gives the consultee a chance to try some of those interventions and then evaluate them. So particularly with social situations that the parents are not involved in and aren't necessarily affected by, they could learn to be a consultant. So that's why communication is so important. If their kid tells them something's going on that's difficult, or even if it's, I'm feeling really depressed, Mom, to be able to listen to the child and ask good questions and offer help,
Mhm.
either through a counselor, a school psychologist, or an outside therapist. But getting back to the whole technology stuff,
Mhm.
I think it's not going to go away. We have to deal with it. But I think it's also super important to encourage their kids to engage in other activities rather than just video games, to play outside, use their imaginations, engage in group extracurricular activity, have friends over, have play dates or hang out. Um, that's so important. Kids have imaginations. They can be creative. They can learn from all the activities that they do. They can build their skills. Um, so I think setting limits, as hard as that is, and that's why, as I said earlier, it's so important for um, parents to communicate with other parents. Um, if parents said, I'm really worried to another parent, I'm really worried about all the time my kid, your kid's best friend, is spending on the video. Um, is there any way we can both make a rule about this so that my kid doesn't feel, um, you know, challenged or you know, um, you know, treated unfairly? But if a group of parents can reach the same sort of agreements about time on videos or the computer was social media, I think that that's helpful. So that's why it's important to limit that. And then social media, particularly for girls, what's research has shown is that it causes depression and low self-esteem, and anxiety. If kids aren't liked, or they see pictures of other people, other kids that look much more beautiful, or um, you know, you don't know what's true on there. I mean, people can post things that really aren't true at all, and they need to. Parents, again, part of this is to monitor their children's mental health. What are signs that my child is really feeling bad about themselves? Um, and we can talk later about self-esteem um, but I think for parents to have their radar tuned in on how their kids feel is super important. And like I said, kids are aware of things, but they're also not terribly good at hiding everything. You know, if if your kid's isolated. Now, I've worked with like middle school families where the kids come home from school and they don't want to play with anybody on the weekend. And I didn't find that necessarily depressing or bad because, middle school's intense.
Yeah.
And, there's a lot of social interaction that's sort of forced on them. And so I can understand kids just wanting to hang out in a quiet environment at home on the weekend. I would pursue it and see if the kid had no friends, and again was just stuck on the computer all the time. But that I've dealt with that even long before computers were so dominant. But so it's important though that parents really monitor their kids' moods, and if something goes on for I mean the something being what looks like depression and sadness and isolation goes on for more than about a week or something, they should certainly contact school staff, the teacher or teachers, and the psychologist, and see if the kid's acting that way at school too, and then do an intervention. The kid should be interviewed and try to find out what's going on, why the kid seems to be so sad, and engage an outside therapist if necessary.
Yeah, and you were touching on this too, but I think this is a really important aspect to mention as well, especially when it comes to the addiction aspect of social media and the internet is, especially today in the era we're in now with it, it's just so easy to access so much information and content. And, you mentioned mass shootings before too, and I want to focus on that type of content specifically because obviously you can make the argument it's important to stay informed on what's going on in the world, but it's also so easy to go down these rabbit holes of darkness and tragedy that can leave you feeling so hopeless, and
Hmm.
can greatly impact anxiety, depression, and other mental illnesses as well. So, from you, how do you think we could better teach kids that, yes, it's important to stay informed, but you can't get caught in endless loops of information overload and doom scrolling, is what they call it as well, to protect their mental health?
Yeah, I think it's one of the most difficult challenges for all of us these days. Um, because it's so easy to get overexposed to information. I have numbers of peers who say, I don't watch the news anymore,
Yeah.
because they don't want to hear all the negative stuff. And, I'm a person that I like to be informed, and I'll watch the news when I'm eating breakfast, lunch, or dinner or something like that. But, it's hard. And particularly, the older you get, the more you're kind of used to seeing like when I was in my teens and 20s and the Vietnam War was going on, and you kind of I remember sort of being immune to, oh, 1,000 soldiers were killed. Of course, I was worried about that myself because I was of the age when I could have been drafted, and so but I could see how being exposed to the information, it's in the same way that the kids exposed to violent video games kind of get numb to it, So in that sense, I guess our own brains kind of protect us from that. But there are people who are just terrified from this sort of stuff. Um, and the other problem with it is, even if we're trying to be informed, what we see particularly lately, there's so many, you know, news stations, and we don't know who to believe. And with all the social media, that people are often believing what they read on posts rather than, reliable news stations like NPR or something like that. Um, so it's extremely difficult. And I think parents have to try to reassure their kids that, well, ask them what they feel about a particular news, and then reassure kids that yes, we're in a safe place here.
Right.
These are things that, I mean, like the first time a kid might read about an airplane crash. That's really scary because, they're not old enough to realize that that's very, very fortunately rare. That doesn't happen all the time. So, but they may say, I don't want to go on a plane because it's going to crash. So putting things in perspective is really um, important for parents to help their kids. Um, but sometimes that's hard to do. Kids will magnify what they're hearing. But I think it's important that they do become aware of what's going on in the world. Um, but I don't think parents should force that on kids. I mean, there are some kids who are 9 or 10, and they're interested in the news and they want to hear what's going on. Um, but I think talking about it's another excuse to talk about values. What's really important. Killing somebody is wrong, period. Um, uh, Not taking care of people in a national and a natural disaster, that's wrong. So, and I remember a kid who was in third grade, and there was uh, a very bad rainstorm or something like that, and the kid was terrified that his house was going to wash down the hill or something like that, which, wasn't likely to happen.
Yeah.
But kids will focus on these things, and since they don't have the perspective to make any sense out of it, I mean, the same is true for us. We're all thinking about what's going on politically, how much is that going to impact us,
Right.
um, and it's a balance. I mean, we're seeing a lot of protests now against some things that are happening. I mean, I'm Jewish, and I often, when I was younger, and still think, if I were growing up in Germany in the 1930s, would I have had the guts to leave
Mm,
and protect myself? And I'm not sure,
yeah.
because it's very hard to take yourself out of where you grew up and move someplace else. Um, so. I think, for parents to educate their kids, if kids have questions about, is this really true? Is this what's happening?
Yeah.
I think they need to identify reliable sources of information. That's one good thing about, Google is, you can, or the computer, you can find information, and try to do that, not just look up one thing, but look up a number of different, if you Google a question, there'll usually be a lot of, a number of different sources, and talk about what reliable sources kids can use. But it's very challenging for adults because of all the deluge of information.
Yeah.
Now, parents may want to have their kids have their same political values.
Mm,
Um, so they may not want to teach their kids that some information is not true. But I think it's important to say, critical thinking is getting as much information as possible, and that situations are not black and white. Everything is gray.
yeah.
Everything is complicated. No, you're not going to tell an 8-year-old that, but you could certainly tell a middle school or a high school kid,
Yeah.
this is not just simple. What do you believe? And, I mean, even now, most of my friends have the same political views I do, but there are some that I care about a lot, and we try to have a peaceful, calm communication so I can understand if somebody doesn't believe everything that I do, to understand where we have agreements about some things. I mean, if you really looked at the United States, and I mean, I would imagine that many people who seem to be on different political sides do have areas where they agree, but it's so hard now. Everybody's so polarized that they don't even
Yeah. Yeah.
talk to each other. And they need to try to understand and empathize with both sides of an issue, and it's perfectly okay to say, I'm curious, why do you believe that? Um, and for kids to, for parents to work with kids, I think, it's very important to say it's not just one or the other. There's, a lot of people have partly similar opinions and partly differing opinions.
Mm,
And, situations are very complicated. It's not all bad or all good, or all right or all wrong. So this is one of the most challenging things, I think, for all of us, not just parents and kids, but to try to deal with these days.
yeah. Yeah, no, I love what you said about it's never just black and white. It's always gray because, yeah, unfortunately, like you also said, it is presented a lot of the time like it is, no, it's just either this way or this way when that's never been the case. And like you mentioned before, when we were kind of talking about bullying, how we do have a lot of people in the public sphere, politicians, athletes, people in Hollywood, and then to bring it back to the internet now, influencers and other public figures online who almost kind of promote that type of arguing that it is just one way or the other instead of having a healthy communication between two people. So, how do you think we see these conversations regarding our climate in that regard presented in our schools among students? And what do you think is the best approach to handling it and making sure students' concerns are heard without it becoming a major argument or inappropriate in the classroom?
Yeah. Well, in many schools, political discussions by teachers are absolutely forbidden.
Right.
Okay. And or the government is trying to prevent open, honest discussions about our U.S. history. That's what I feel is very wrong now. I'll say that now. Students need to be taught historical truth and learn from all the sides of historical issues, particularly from middle school on. So trying to hide slavery and what we did to the Native Americans or immigrants like the Japanese during World War II or the Chinese is really wrong. I mean, we have to admit that we have made mistakes. Now, some people would argue with me and say, no, those weren't mistakes. Um, but I think again, it's black and white issues, and but I don't think people, adults or kids, have to feel guilty for things that their ancestors did, because that was part of the culture. I mean, if you happen to have a grandfather who was in the Ku Klux Klan, and was hurting black people, uh, you know, if you don't feel that way, you don't have to, excuse me, assume responsibility for what your grandparent or great grandparent or great great grandparent did. So I think again, it's like as I was saying with the black and white, you have to l- learn how complex situations are. So in our eighth grade history class, they used to have issues that students would take one side or the other of and research and present,
Right.
and they would have very interesting debates about them.
Yes.
So I think that's really good. So, but I think kids need to learn how values, including negative ones like greed and fear and selfishness, can affect the actions that peoples and government take. I mean, I think what's going on now is based on a lot of fear. Fear that, among white males, that women and immigrants are going to take over the country, and I don't think that's true. There's a lot of greed, obviously. We've seen with all these billionaires and everything that
Yeah.
things ought to be done to satisfy our greed. But I think, fear and selfishness, where people grow up not only caring about themselves, and that's an American value, really, is I'm number one. I'm the most important thing. And there's not, as there is in other cultures, a greater sense of community. We all take care of each other, that thing, So there's always been that eagerness among Americans to, reach their highest pinnacle.
Yeah.
And, and part of doing that is that other people may be left out or abandoned or put down and that kind of thing. So, I think what can be taught in schools is respect.
Yeah.
Um, a number of years ago, I think in 2009, I wrote a fairly long article for parents about teaching kids respect or how to respect others. And, it's super important. And, what we're seeing now politically shows absolutely no respect whatsoever. And that's really wrong. You can disagree with somebody, but how you have to learn, kids have to learn if you disagree, how do you do that? Um, how do you disagree in a respectful way? You try to understand, to ask questions why the other person might think or feel that way. That's respectful. Find areas maybe where you can agree. Oh, yeah, I see why you think that way. Yeah, I kind of agree with that too. Where you see what's in the middle. Um, And I think teachers, when if they're having any discussions or debates in the classroom, they have the responsibility to set the rules. Um, you know, use a moderate voice, um, use respectful language, use curiosity, try to understand, show empathy, try to really to put yourself in that other person's shoes, rather than just criticizing or putting someone else down or defaming them. So there's a lot to do that. And we see adults these days just don't do that.
Yeah.
You know, if you disagree with somebody, you just put them, oh, that's so stupid. You're an idiot, you know? Like what we saw with the, calling that woman who was killed in Minneapolis, a domestic terrorist or an idiot, and those kind of things. That doesn't solve any problems. It doesn't help us understand. Um, so, but I think you want kids to be heard. You want them to be able to say their opinion, but setting the proper atmosphere for that to happen so that kids they don't have to be afraid. Um, and to be able for teachers and other kids to say, well, there's some information that maybe you might be interested in that has a little different view of that. Are you willing to listen to that? Again, respectfully communicating so that um, maybe somebody will be open to it. I mean, I remember when I was young, um, I didn't get along that well with my father. He was very, kind of controlling, and he was a real Democrat, and my mother was a Republican, and so I was actually for Nixon instead of Kennedy in the 1960 election. I was like 13 or 14, and when I got older, I realized that I loved Kennedy, and I changed my opinion. But you know, kids may take on the opinion of the parent that they're closer to. But when you get older, you learn more, and you have to be open to that. So I think the openness is really important, um, and to encourage kids to like I said, it's not all black and white, and there's lots of information here. And you can say, I know there's a lot of information and it may be hard to digest all of that, but there are different sides, and we want to try to understand how other people feel.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. I love that a big overarching theme of everything that we're talking about in terms of how we can set kids up the best for the best success in terms of self-respect, respecting others, healthy communication is this idea and the concept of self-advocacy and respecting and advocating for yourself. So, how do you think we can motivate kids to advocate for themselves and their emotional needs in order to protect their mental health? And then I'm curious from you if there are things that you experienced in your own upbringing and triumphs that you've been able to channel when helping students with said self advocacy.
Yes. That's a wonderful question, and it's so important actually. So I would say that one of the most critical traits to develop in kids and adults is positive self-esteem.
Mm,
Okay. Because if you have positive self-esteem, you're more able to advocate for yourself. Okay. So what does that mean, self-esteem? So, being a child, as I said earlier, means learning all the time, and that you make mistakes. And as I said before, most communication from both parents and teachers is criticism and correction. So kids grow up feeling less than,
mm,
okay? And they are, because they have to, learn and
grow.
grow. But in order to help children develop self-advocacy skills, they need to feel that they are worthwhile human beings and deserve to have their requests at least listened to. So if they have some positive self-esteem, they're more likely to have the courage to ask for what they want. Not that they'll always get what they want, but they need to ask. Nothing ventured, nothing gained, So if you don't ask, you're not going to get it. So I think what's important is for the adults in a child's life to counteract the criticism and corrections that kids get constantly. So that includes both parents and teachers. So try to balance the corrections with compliments. Okay. And a child doesn't have to win every game or get only A's, but compliments can be for good, positive, helpful behaviors. And they don't have to be big deals. You know, if a kid picks up their desk mate's book that fell on the floor, that was so sweet of you to do that. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Um, or if they try hard to do something academically and wasn't quite right. I could see how hard you were trying on that. Let's make this little correction here. You're almost there. Um, no one's perfect and no one has to be best at every skill, but everybody can be kind, empathic, respectful, and there are small and large actions that can be complimented. Now, I will sort of have a slight correction to that statement, and that's that there are some people who are psychopaths, sociopaths, and narcissists. And a number of years ago, one of my principal colleagues gave me a book about how the brain is really wired that way. I
Mhm.
mean, we can think of narcissistic people in public, um, and it's very, very hard to change them. Um, they care only about themselves. It's hard for them to, or if not hard, impossible to experience empathy. But, most of the kids that I ever worked with, and there are thousands of them, they would feel remorse if they did something wrong. They did have, a kind side of them. They weren't always mean.
Mhm.
Um, I like to assume that most kids can learn empathy. I mean, you even see that in little kids,
Mhm.
2 or 3 years old. Another little child is crying and the kid goes over to them and pats them on the head or something like that. So, they want to comfort people that are having difficulties. So compliments can be very helpful to kind of balance the corrections that, all kids experience. So, and, it took me a while sort of to learn that myself. I may have even been 40 or 50 or something before I realized, it's not a winner, a win-lose situation. I used to think, well, if I give somebody a compliment, that means I'm not going to get one or something like that. Well, I learned eventually that, I mean, not that I wouldn't do that, but as I worked on my job more and more, I realized it's great to give people compliments and I used to get them back a lot, So I saw that that was really important. But they can be, you know, um, very minor kinds of things. I don't want to say minor, but like taking, somebody falls down and you take them to the nurse from the playground, or as I said, pick up a book, or compliment, you compliment somebody else, or stick up for a friend. If somebody's being mean and you stick up for that person, no, that's very good. Um, and saying something nice to someone else, oh, that's really a pretty sweater you have on.
Mhm.
That was so nice of you to comment that way, so there's definitely way, and thanking a parent, Mommy, thanks so much for such a good meal.
Yeah.
Honey, that makes me feel really good when you thanked me. So the more you can reinforce, by thanking somebody for the compliment, the more they're apt to do it. Um, so, so if kids grow up thinking that they are basically good people rather than just good at a skill,
Yeah.
that really boosts their self-esteem. I'm a good person. I deserve to get to do this. And In my own upbringing, because you asked about, myself, I was a really good student. And interestingly, my parents didn't want to overinflate my ego.
Mm,
So they weren't, you know, complimenting me every time I got an A on something or, a good grade. My father was very critical of me, as I said, and that was very difficult. But on the other hand, both my parents were actually very kind to others and set a good role model for me. I never heard them badmouth other people. I never did. The only one they talked about bad was Adolf Hitler, and
mm,
that I understand. Um, so they helped me to be, I saw my mother's kindness and my father's generosity and my mother's generosity, and that helped me to be what I hope I am, a kind and loving person that I turned out to be. Now, being an only child, I was able to ask for what I wanted.
mm,
Um, Not that I got whatever, I wanted all the time,
mm,
but I did feel confident enough to ask. So, my own self-esteem was kind of interesting because when I was 10 years old, I said I had an superiority complex. I
mm,
mean, even at that age, I was thinking about that because I wasn't an athlete and I was small,
right.
but I knew I was really good at school. So, at least I could recognize what I was good at and what I wasn't good at. But I don't think I put them down, put myself down. But when working with kids, I really, really worked hard on developing their self-esteem and asking them teaching them to ask for what they wanted, and particularly effective ways of doing that. And you might say, well, how did I know what a kid's self-esteem was like? And it was interesting. I would tell them, when I was getting to know a kid, I would say things like, tell me three or four things you really like about yourself. And I said, that's not bragging, it's just between you and me.
Mm,
And, some younger kids would say, well, I'm a really good reader, or I'm good at soccer, or things like that. And then as they got older, like in fifth, sixth grade or up, they said, well, I'm a really nice person. I'm a good friend. They would do more psychological, emotional personality traits. But there were some kids, well, I'm not good at anything. Those are the ones that I would really worry about. And I would continue to work with them to try to build their self-esteem. Um, and I would even, I created uh, for them what I would call a self-esteem bank.
mm,
Um, I would ask them, what do we do with the bank?
mm,
Well, we put money in it. And I said, when you need it, the money, you can take it out. And so I said, what I'd like you to do every day before you go to bed, you don't have to write it down, although I did have students who did like to write these down. Uh, I want you to think of one thing that happened today that you're proud of. It doesn't have to be a big deal. You could have um, helped a kid, given a kid a compliment. Yes, you could have gotten an A on your spelling test, or made five baskets, at the recess basketball game. But
mm,
but it doesn't have to be a big deal. And I want you to write that down because, and I'd say, why do you think I want you to do this bank? And, often they wouldn't know exactly. I said, because sometime you'll need it.
mm,
Um, Somebody might say something to you um, that's mean and hurtful. It might come from outside. Oh, you're such a jerk, or you're really lousy at that. And you want to go into your self-esteem bank and say, wait a second, I know I'm good at this. I'm a fun person. I'm a nice person. I'm good at this. And you you don't have to take in what that person said. But sometimes it's internal. You make a mistake and you say, oh God, I'm so stupid. I can't do this. And then you go into that self-esteem bank again and remember, wait a second, everybody makes mistakes. I know I'm a good person in this way, in this way, in this way, and I'm good at that. So it really helps you undo either the negative comments that we impose on ourselves or that somebody from outside imposes on us. So I think the higher one's self-esteem, the more able we are to ask for what we need. Now, some people like to be independent, and I mean, I've always been a pretty independent person and not asked for much help. But the older I get, the more I say, yeah, maybe I could ask somebody for this help. And it's not a put down of myself. I think that's particularly for men. You've probably heard of that old story. Somebody's lost driving a car, and the wife might say, "Well, stop in at that gas station and just ask them where to go." And the man will say, "Oh no, I'm going to figure it out myself."
Mhm.
So there is that sense of so the question is, what is real self-advocacy? I mean, part of it is recognizing that you want something and need something. The one time that I felt was a triumph for me in self-advocacy. I never told you how I became a school psychologist. I graduated from the University of California, Berkeley in math in 1967 and started a PhD program in statistics.
Mhm.
And I I was in the last cohort of students, graduate students who had 1 year of deferment. So in 1968, I had to figure, do I go to jail? I was, growing up an undergraduate in the 60s, I was very anti-war. Do I go to jail? Do I go to Canada and escape? Do I get drafted and killed? Or do I join the Army Reserve? And the next year, I joined a hospital unit in the Presidio in San Francisco. And following year, I didn't actually go to basic training for another whole year, but I had to choose an advanced training, and I had a choice of nurse or psychology social work specialist, and I had no idea the Army even had that. And I was trained with that and worked at Brooke Army Hospital in um, San Antonio. But then I came home and I went to work for Blue Shield Health Insurance. I was going to be an actuary,
Yeah.
which are the people that do all the statistics with insurance premiums. And anyway, so I had worked there in a couple of summers when I was an undergraduate. And but then the following year, in 1971, when you're in the Army Reserve, you have to go to summer camp for 2 weeks a year for 6 years.
Mhm.
And I was sitting next to a relatively new um, guy in my company, and he told me, we were talking, he told me he was in a counseling and school psychology program at Stanford. I'd never even heard of school psychology before,
Wow.
but I thought, well, that sounds interesting. And so that fall, I took a class at San Francisco State and clinical psychology, but I was thinking, I'm 25 now, and it's harder to get into a clinical psych program. But I'd never even had a psych class as an undergraduate. So the following year, I re-enrolled at UC Berkeley as an undergraduate, took a year of school psychology, um, and or as a year of psychology classes. But that fall, after 1 quarter, I had to apply. Unfortunately, I got into the program, but but that's summer before. My father was saying, "Oh, don't change your career.
Mhm.
Keep keep working on being an actuary." And fortunately, I was able to advocate for myself. Um, I don't think I gave a lot of reasons, but my gut said this is what I want to do. So I actually was able to tell my father, no, I'm going back to school and I'm going to do this new career.
Yeah.
And so I think that was sort of my triumph because if I had listened to my father and said, all right, I'll do that, I wouldn't have been happy with what I
Right.
ended up doing.
Yeah.
So it's a long story, but a very interesting one, actually.
Definitely. Definitely. No, and to close us off, I want to kind of zoom out for a second because obviously, every school district in America is different, and especially in the way they budget or can fund certain mental health resources, such as school counselors or school psychologists. So, from your perspective, from where you were able to do the amazing work that you did, what are the biggest differences in how these sort of conflicts are addressed for kids who are from more affluent areas versus where schools that have kind of a lower budget or lack of access to resources that can help kids?
Yeah. I mean, if I had my way, every school would have school psychologists and or counselors. Well, they would need the school psychologists to do the assessment of kids, but have counselors. And unfortunately, not all districts have that kind of money. They're funded by the state. Um, so and children in more affluent areas generally have parents with health insurance that covers private therapy. So that's really important too, um, if that's determined to be necessary and helpful. But Medicaid also provides therapy and mental health services for low-income families, so that have Medicaid, so that can be helpful. Um, as I said, the more affluent school districts may have a lower ratio of students to school psychologists. The National Association of School Psychologists recommends like a 1 to 500, one psychologist to 500 students, because not all students need that. I'd even make it lower because now I recognize in modern times here how much a school psychologist can be helpful to a lot of kids. They don't all have to have major psychological issues. So it's only the most severe cases that a psychologist would deal with. So I think, having one person available for more kids is really helpful. But so that varies depending on the amount of money that the school um, has. So the ratio may be high, you know, and services may be limited. But in lower income areas, one advantage is that, particularly in cities, schools often have a social worker who can help deal with mental health and financial issues and family issues. Like we didn't have a social worker connected with the school district at all. But all public schools are required to have um, school psychologists to assess students, but those with lower budgets may not be able to, they just may limit their psychologists to assessing for special education, which does include emotional disturbance. So, there are 13 areas that the federal government mandates need to be assessed, or the kids can possibly qualify for special ed. So school psychologists have to be there. But one reason I loved my job was that I could also counsel kids and set up groups and talk to parents and all that kind of stuff. But if the amount of assessment is taking up most of that psychologist's time, then that's not helping. But social workers can really, really help there. Um, and I think at this point there's a much higher need for school mental health services than there are school psychologists and counselors who are employed. So even students in higher income districts may need more frequent services than are available. But at least in the high income districts, you can um, recommend an outside therapist to help the child. Um, I'm not sure how that works for lower, well, if a family has Medicare or Medicaid or Medi-Cal in California, then they may be able to get outside therapy. But working with the social worker could be helpful too. because they're trained to deal with counseling. But it's challenge. It's very challenging. And, if enough parents got together to encourage the administration of a poorer district to provide some kind, even one day a week is better than nothing, or, enable the psychologist to have part of his or her time to do some counseling. Um, you know, I, it's a difficult question, but that's one thing I really believe is that everybody needs access to mental health. And if anybody's listening to this, they realize how important it is because, so much is challenging kids these days, whether it's, um, academic stress or um, social media, um, or politics, what's going on in the world, and kids really need help to reach a better place of mental health.
Beautifully said. Well, Dr. Gold, thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me today and offer your expertise and experience on this very important subject matter and how we can best continue to protect for, care for our children and their mental health as well. I really appreciate it.
Okay.
Thank you.
It's been my pleasure. I hope I was able to communicate some important messages here.
Definitely, definitely. And for everyone back home to learn more about Dr. Gold's own story, the topics we discussed today, or to even reach out yourself to contact him, you could check the links in the description and read more. Once again, I'm Eric Mastrota with the National Digest. Thanks for watching, everyone.